Well, turn in your Bibles to Luke 16. I'm just kind of a creature of habit. I sympathize with Calvin, John Calvin, who was exiled for how many years? 20? A long time. Maybe not 20. Years and years. And when he came back, he picked right up where he left off. I think it was in Isaiah somewhere. Next verse. He didn't care if it was Easter, Christmas, didn't matter. Next verse. Let's go. So that's been my plan through the parables of Christ, and I'm working through Luke, of course. And so we come now to Luke 16, which is titled, at least in some of these scriptures, as the parable of the dishonest manager. Could be the parable of the unrighteous steward, but I'll just refer to it as the dishonest manager. So let's read it, Luke 16, and then we'll go from there. So he says, he also said, this is Jesus speaking, he also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who's faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And it just goes on to say the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. So they go from grumbling and murmuring, muttering, to now ridicule. So this is the parable, another one we find only in Luke's gospel, and it comes on the heels of the prodigal son and the lost coin and the lost sheep, when he had spoken on those, because they're complaining, the Pharisees and scribes were complaining about, look at him, he's spending time with sinners. He's a friend of sinners. Look how he's spending so much time with them. So that brings in these teachings from Christ. And it is one of the most challenging parables to understand. And it's caused many debates, actually, when you can see why. When you read it and you may think, whoa, what's going on here? And there's similarities from other parables, like the prodigal son. You have someone squandering another's wealth. You have also similar characteristics from other themes and parables of, you're called to give an account. And so Jesus, he told parables on all kinds of things. He was always teaching in parables, as we're told. That would be the Messiah's really defining style and characteristic of teaching. So he's always teaching in parables. Parables about the kingdom, parables about grace, parables about growth and fruitfulness, parables about forgiveness. See, parables about repentance. Now the Lord gives us here a parable about money and possessions and eternity, which rings a bell about a certain book someone's written. So this is a parable about that very thing, and it's a spiritual reality. It's a powerful spiritual reality that he draws directly from everyday life and the way the world works. Think of that. It's the way the world works. And Jesus observes these things, and he draws out from that spiritual application, spiritual warnings, spiritual exhortations, spiritual realities. And it's interesting to note, too, that sometimes in Jesus' parables, he will use shady or even bad characters to make incredibly important points, won't he? And you have this sleepy, irritated man who will eventually open the door to give the guy what he needs, just to get him to go away. I thought you were my friend. Well, I'm not opening the door because you're my friend. I'm opening because I'm tired and irritated at you. You won't go away. And then you've got an unrighteous judge who finally will give justice to a poor widow because she just won't go away. So, he does this. And then, we have these lesser to greater reality points that Jesus draws out. So, what will a loving, gracious, compassionate God do when you knock on his door? Gracious, compassionate God, the judge of all the earth, what will he do when you persist and come to him? Will he not give you justice and do what's right? And if this smart, evil man can use his time and resources and ensure a good future, what will you do regarding heavenly realities, the heavenly future? And I love how James Montgomery Boyce opened up his chapter on this parable. He said, think of this. He said, sin is always involved. When you're dealing with human beings, sin is involved. It plays a part. So he wisely says, sin traps people in indifference so that they often become more foolish about their self-preservation than animals. Geese and other birds will fly south as winter approaches. Rodents will store up for winter. Some animals hibernate. But human beings proceed in a manner they know is foolish and characteristically fail to make adequate provision for the future. That's a good starting place when we're looking at this parable here. So let's do. With the parable, you almost have to just walk through it, verse by verse, almost like a running commentary, and then we'll draw out some meat and potatoes, some substance that we can take away from it. So look at it, verse 1. He says, he also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him, that this man was wasting his possessions. Now, first off, let me just say, this parable doesn't lend itself very kindly to the allegorical style, where it's like, oh, okay, I see this guy represents this thing represents this. It doesn't do that. If you get into that too deeply, you'll end up confused and misguided, I think. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I get to this little section about what the parable's not teaching. But you can't do that with this parable. In fact, I'm even hesitant to call the rich man representing God as I think about it more closely. And even John Calvin. Now, when I say even John Calvin, y'all should listen up. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Well, even John Calvin says, to inquire with great exactness into every minute part of a parable is an absurd mode of philosophizing. And it's Kelsey Kunkel's birthday. Happy birthday, Kelsey. So to inquire into every exact minute detail is an absurd mode of philosophizing when going with a parable. You don't want to do that, especially with this one. Some it's pretty clear and pretty obvious, but not this one. You'll get in trouble. You'll get off base. So what are we seeing first off in this story? We have this man, he has an estate, and he has great wealth. And he has a man managing his property, okay? He manages just about everything, sort of like Joseph did for Potiphar. Remember that? Potiphar trusted him. He was talented. He was trustworthy. He had proven himself in certain ways that skilled, and so he entrusted everything to him. Look, you take charge of all my property, and he's not going to worry about it. So this is sort of the idea. And that's how it is with life, too. There's people who manage people's assets and resources. Well, he was in charge of all this rich man's estate. It would be his crops, that would be contracts, agreements with him, with other people, customers. He would be able to write the contracts, so he was over all of it. And the rich man didn't have to be concerned about it. And it was his job, think of this, it was his job to be a good steward. To be honest and manage things well is his job. It's his responsibility. But he wasn't honest. He wasn't faithful. He wasn't wise about his stewardship. And eventually, what happens? Witnesses, charges start coming against him. And they're brought to this master's attention that this manager is wasting your possessions. You know, Mr. Manager guy you have over your whole state? You need to know about what's going on, like what he's doing with your stuff, with your wealth, with your possessions. He's squandering. And so, that's the charge. The charge is wastefulness, squandering his master's possessions. And that's the only thing he needs to hear, isn't it? He didn't need to hear about any other kind or form of immorality. This is the charge. Squandering his possessions, his master's possessions. And he really was guilty, wasn't he? He was guilty. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't say, wait, time out, let me explain. No, he knew. He knew he was guilty. There's no self-defense. There's no question that he's guilty. He's found out. He's caught. And so the master, he called him and said, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. It's like he fired him on the spot. So what's this I hear about you? You being irresponsible, squandering, I would never have hired you if that were the case, right? So you can't be manager anymore. Turn in the books. I want to see on paper. I want to see the trail. I want to see what's going on. I want to see what's happened. And the thing is, now he's no longer trusted, is he? Because a multitude of witnesses have brought this charge, and it has weight, has authority enough to get him fired. And the manager's, he eventually, obviously in the past, has risen to this level of trust and skill and responsibility. And like I said, trustworthiness was his job. It was his job description. He's skillful with assets and property and possessions, so he's trusted. But now, he's fired. He's required to give an account of his business dealings. Give an account. And so, verse 3, the manager said to himself, what do I do? What shall I do? Since my master's taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. So, think of this. He saw the issue clearly. And then he began to speak to himself. And that's what the Bible often has people, individuals, speaking to themselves, reasoning with themselves, getting honest with themselves. And Luke has that going on a lot. And here we have it again. He began to speak to himself. He said to himself, here's the situation. Judgment's coming. I'm guilty. Now what? See? And he says, I'm not strong. I don't have the strength to do what's required. I'm ashamed. I've got shame involved to do this other stuff that's required. So I better get smart about this. I better wise up. I better figure something out. And that's what he does. And all of a sudden, the idea comes in verse 4. He says, I've decided what to do. Now, okay, I've decided. I've made my decision. So that when I'm removed from management, from my job, people may receive me into their houses. So he's going to be homeless. He probably lived there, managed the place. His home was there. His livelihood was there. If he were a slave, we have other pictures that will happen to them. Cut that guy up. You see, but here he was a free man. He was a manager. So now he's just basically going to be out. He's going to have to figure out what to do. So think of this. He not only saw the issues clearly and cared about the outcome, but he also did something about it. And again, I feel like at this point I need to offer another warning that we don't break down parables too far and end up missing the point. For example, right here, you would not say, since God has fired me, now the only way I can go to heaven is to make friends with those who are going to go to heaven, and so that then they will let me in, and because God won't. Yeah, I've burned my bridge with God, so I've got to find another way in, and it's through them. That would be wrong, right? That's the wrong view of God. That's the wrong view of how salvation works. That is not how salvation works. So this really is not even a parable about salvation, the plan of salvation. It's heresy to think along those lines. And people do. I'm going to offer up my prayers to them. I'm going to give money to them so then I can get, so I can win. So that just digresses into all kinds of heresy. If you're going to break down the parable too far, you'll miss the point. So look what's going on with the manager. Look what's going on in his mind that is commendable. Just three things, basically. Number one, he's understanding the issue honestly and clearly. He's thinking it over carefully. See, if someone guilty of sin can only get to that step, where you're honestly, sincerely seeing what's going on and understanding the issue, that's a good first step. And number two, he's considering his only option. He's considering his only option, and he's wisely and shrewdly making plans for the future. So he's seeing things honestly, understanding them. He's thinking it over carefully, and now he's considering his only option and making plans to carry it out. And then three, he gets up and takes action. He does not waste time. He gets up now and takes action. Now that's commendable, isn't it? And look what he does. It says, so, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. And he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. So we'll pause right there. So a lot of times people paid back when they borrowed, they would pay back in kind. If they borrowed wheat, they would pay back in wheat if they didn't have the cash. So he's not asking them to sit down and write a check for half of what you owe. That's not what he's doing. He's cutting their debt down. See, he went to multiple customers and began to rewrite their contracts. That's what he did. Probably he had the authority to do that. And at the moment, as far as they knew, he still had whatever authority. And they were probably contracts that he initiated and agreed with them about. And now it's a much smaller amount they're going to owe the landowner. For example, the 100 measures of oil, that was no small. That was huge. That was a lot. That was, I think it's just under 900 gallons of olive oil. Now, folks around there don't just walk around with 900 gallons of olive oil. This is big business. These are big business commodities and borrowing against real big business debt. And so this is about 3 years' worth of supply of olive oil. Like 150 olive trees production. This is huge. And it was reduced by half. And that's pretty big stuff, isn't it? He's reduced his debt by half. So he had 3 years' worth of debt cut down to a year and a half. And that's good news for someone who borrows, even for business, isn't it? 100 measures of wheat was even more. This is like 10 years' worth of wheat supply. This is like 1,000 bushels of wheat. I don't know if any of us here deal with that kind of measurement or amount of wheat. No, we just go back and buy wheat or flour whenever we need it at the grocery store. But this is 1,000 bushels of wheat, 10 years' worth of wheat, 30 tons of wheat. And so he says, go and write 80. You don't owe 100 anymore, you owe 80. So this is about 2 years of debt he's knocked off this guy's supply. and what he owed this rich man. And so you get the impression that, it wasn't just these two guys either. It was more of a long list of them. He's going down the list. He's spending that whole day. He's got people lining up. Oh, this other guy, he's making write-offs. And so he's gathered them all, probably, and he's writing off their debts, chopping them down. And so Jesus' audience would certainly understand and agree that this was making him very favorable in these people's eyes, in the debtor's eyes. He's making good friends, really good friends. And in the Jewish society, you almost you're forced to get into the Jewish culture to gather understanding for these parables. So the Jewish society, reciprocation was a big deal. Big deal. If somebody did something for you, you respond in kind, or it's offensive. If somebody had you over for dinner, for example, you have them over for dinner. It's pretty obvious. It was customary. It was a societal custom to do that. So he goes to these customers who owed these huge business debts, and he rewrites what they owe. He gives these huge write-offs, these huge discounts. Hey, how much do you owe my master? How much do you owe our company? Or how much do you owe? Oh, that's a lot. 100? Here, rewrite 50, and I'll sign it. Let's renegotiate your contract. You need a discount. That's too much. How much do you owe? Let's rewrite it. Rewrite it to 80. I'll sign it. You've got a new contract. How about that? Now, can you imagine the people's response? Like, wow, really? Like, okay, thank you. Yes. I mean, I at Lowe's, from being in the military, I get a 10% discount. And I'm finding little discounts all over the place now because I'm not ashamed to ask anymore. At zoos and Lowe's and I forget where it was. Golden Chick. Remember, Lainey? They gave me 20% off at Golden Chick. They saw my credit card. It was a USA credit card. Like, oh, were you in the military? Yeah. Oh, you get a discount. How much? I'll give you 20. Like, well, good deal. I think I might come back here. You're my friend. Well, this is sort of what's going on. Wow, thank you. Anytime you need anything, just let me know. See, that's what's going on. He's thinking this through. And look what the master does now in verse 8. Verse 8, he says, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Now, dishonest manager is used in this verse. It might be unjust steward or unrighteous steward. There's other ways of saying it in other translations, but that's the point. Here's the reason why this parable is even called this in verse 8, because the master, just a little, this is not a knock on the King James, but the King James says the Lord, right? It almost sounds like Jesus, but it's not. It would be the master, the rich man, commends this guy. He's commending the manager. And the word commend could also be the same word for praise. He's praising him, commending him. Why? Because he made a shrewd decision. That's why. He wisely made the best out of a bad situation for himself. A lot of speculation. You read commentaries on this, oh my. They are all over the map. They're all speculating as to why. Why would he have commended him? Why? Why did he do that? And again, we have to be careful with the parable because this never happened. This is something Jesus made up. This is a story. He's making a point. He's using his own story. There was no master. There was no steward. He's using this as a story to make a point, isn't he? Well, just to give you a few ideas, some people speculate, well, this is a sudden inflow of cash for this manager because now the debt's so much further, they may be more eager just to pay it off. Some say, well, the manager, what he's done is he's given himself too much commission. So he's written off his own commission. And so that now, they don't owe as much because he's not going to take any money. He's done a noble thing. Or, instead of now skimming off the top of all this money the master's making. That was his skim. That was his gravy that he was taking. Now it's more fair market value. There are all kinds of ideas that could be the case legitimately, but we don't know that. So let's just not even go there. All we know, what we do know, is the master commended him for being very shrewd. You've been very wise. He said, it's like the master saying, you are a pretty sharp guy. Wow, you're pretty impressive. You're very smart. And so he commends him for this shrewdness. And shrewd, just that word, it's an adverb, phronimos. Phronimos? Alan's like, yep, I got that, remember? I love picking on you because you're the Greek student. Phronimos, it's the only time this word's used in the New Testament. Luke has a lot of those only time words, and this is one of them. Only time it's used. Shrewd, which can mean wise. You look up the word shrewd in the dictionary, and it has a lot of, or not in a dictionary, in a thesaurus. It has a laundry list of synonyms. And so he was shrewd, and that's what he's commended for. He took careful advantage of his opportunity, his one opportunity. And he worked the situation, didn't he? He worked it, and now even the master's saying, wow, you're impressive. Good for you. And then we have in the next verses, which the second half of verse 8, which I think the parable ends basically halfway right there. And now we're getting some of Jesus' commentary. He says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. So here Jesus, he begins providing some commentary for us on what he's getting at. And he starts by comparing the sons of this world to the sons of light and their ability to successfully deal with their own generation or their own age, their own contemporaries, their own kind. And that's quite an indictment, isn't it, coming from the perspective of the Son of God himself. And he'd been observing, he'd been watching people. And he concluded that, hey, the ungodly and worldly men are more industrious and skillful in conducting the affairs of this temporary life, this fading life. Ecclesiastes would say, this vain life. They're more skillful in navigating and industrious than the children of God are about the things of heaven and the things of the kingdom, the things of eternity. It's like, that's not good. And so this is where he's driving. And money is eventually going to fail, isn't it? He says, when it fails. Not if, when. When it fails, it may succeed in certain ways, in certain aspects of your life, but it's going to fail eventually. And when it does, you ought to be using it now for lasting good, for the eternal blessing of others. And when you do that, it has a circular effect to being a blessing to you too. So these true riches, these earthly possessions are not the real riches, the lasting eternal riches. They're just very temporary, and they will fail. And God makes it clear that it's all going to be taken away. I mean, you've heard it taught before. When you die, you can't take it with you, right? You can't. None of it. So when you die, it's all going to be gone. So you need to use it now for good. You need to make friends. Well, how do I do that? With this unrighteous wealth. And it's interesting, he calls it unrighteous wealth. Are there other, I didn't take time to look up other ways it said. Unrighteous wealth is the ESV. Does anyone else say anything different? It may say mammon or Worldly wealth. Yes. Okay. Yeah. The wealth of unrighteousness. We'll take it, it's a way of referring to basically money, monetary money and resources, material goods. And I think it's rightly called unrighteous wealth, as I understand it, because it's so ingrained, it's so integral to being a part of this world system. And it's so ingrained even with being used for evil, immoral, greedy, scheming, corruptive things. It's the foundation for it. And so, what do we do? I was just thinking too, some of you may have a $20 bill or any cash in your possession. You have no idea where that thing's been and what it's been used for over the last 20 years, if it's that old, or 10 years. Who knows? That thing right there might have been used for a very, very immoral thing. But now it's in your possession. What are you going to do with that? And he says, make friends with it. He says, take some of that money and spend it on the good of others, right? Now, not wastefully, frivolously, thoughtlessly, carelessly, but wisely, shrewdly, and especially for their spiritual good. So you can give that in a way that will be to the benefit, the spiritual good of others. And so that's what he's exhorting us to do. Be rich in good works. And use that for that purpose. And let's turn for a minute to 1 Timothy 6. I want us to look at this verse together. 1 Timothy 6, starting in verse 17. This is Paul, of course. And when he's writing to Timothy, the pastor of the church he's there in, he's given this exhortation for the rich people. He says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them to what? To give away everything they own to the poor? No. Charge them to not be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. He goes on. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for what? For the future. So that, you have a thus and a so that in that verse, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. That's getting to it right there, isn't it? So that they can take hold of that which is truly life. Now, we can think in a worldly way, like, it is wise to save for the future, for when you're too old to work, so you can be self-sustaining. I think that's wise. But some people take it too far. They think, I'm going to save and save and save so I can have millions when I'm 70, and then I'll really live. No, that's just backwards, isn't it? Your body starts breaking down. You're not going to be able to do the things you thought you would do physically. Eventually you may not even be able to drive. You may not even want to go to an airport at that point. You see, you think you've got this long life that's truly life now that I don't have to work. But that's just wrong. This is the true life. Blessing others, using your resources for others' good, and then it is, like Paul's saying, it is storing up treasures for the future and for what is truly life, which would be eternal, right? In verse 10, Jesus goes on, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? Now there's quite a statement. There's quite an exhortation. we have this again, this argument from the lesser to the greater. Lesser to the greater. What would the lesser be? What would the little thing be referring to in this context? Anyone want to? What's the little thing? What did you say? The unrighteous wealth. Bingo. Money. Isn't it something? Money to Jesus is a little thing. That's a little thing. It's not a big deal to him at all. It's a little thing. The greater thing would be the true riches. The true riches. Like I say, Jesus for money is just amazing. Right here. It's the little thing. It's a little thing to him, and to the world, it's everything, isn't it? Money is everything to the world, and it's in contrast to the true riches. This money is just, if you only knew how valuable eternity and the things of heaven are, you'd be using these little things all for that. It's like the guy that found the treasure in the field, remember? He spent everything he had, every nickel, to buy that field. He gave up the little things to get the great thing, to get the true wealth. And it doesn't even belong to you anyway, these little things. It's not even yours. You're a steward. It's all God's, right? All of it's his. See, verse 12, if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? So this unrighteous manager, in a way, he's a beacon to be avoided, as J.C. Ryle said. He's not some exemplary guy. He's not a pattern to be followed. He's a warning sign. He really is. I was thinking about that. Who will give you that which is your own? God's going to give you something that will truly be yours forever, for your enjoyment, for your good, and for eternity. And I was thinking about how this guy ended up. Did he end up with that which was his own? No, he ended up in other people's houses. He's couch surfing, or he's just living in other people's homes. Well, at least he's not on the street. Well, that's his best option. How much more with God? How much more with him? So he's saying God will give you that which will be yours forever. Moth and rust and thief can't steal and destroy. It's yours. It's really yours. And God will give it to you. Paul and the Corinthians got kind of that way a little bit. And in 1 Corinthians, he had to do just constant correcting and things, to the point where they even thought, well, Peter's my teacher, Paul's my teacher, these are my teachers, and these are my gifts, and these are my resources I'm using for my Lord's Supper. I'm sorry you guys don't have any food. And you see, they got kind of selfish like that in a way. And Paul kind of summed it up well. He said, let no one boast in men, 1 Corinthians 3:21 and following. Let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world, think of that, the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. It's all yours. And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. See, it's if you only knew what was really yours. The filthy lucre, as I think the King James call it in one place, filthy lucre. That filthy lucre in your pocket, the unrighteous mammon, you wouldn't be caring quite so much about that if you just could lay hold of that which is really yours. I got to get moving here. And I think there will be time for questions. And I'm dreading men's study tonight, by the way. Okay, there's an important question. Because he says, no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Can't do it. He says, he didn't say you should not serve God and money. He says you cannot. It is a definitive, can't be done. I think one pastor I heard say it's like trying to take a left turn and a right turn at the same time. You just can't do that. It's the same with God and money. You have to make an either-or choice which you're going to serve. Is it going to be God or is it going to be money? So the question is, how do we serve money? How do we serve money? Let me have at least an answer or two from you all. How does a human being serve money? Neglecting the things of God to pursue money? It's a great sweeping statement. Let's get more granular. Small. Consumes their energy, their time, their days. Now that's getting more to what, like specifically in my notes. That's right though. Any other ideas? How do you serve money? Money becomes the master, so that it's now directing the course of the affairs and the course of your life. Well said. I think I can just skip these notes. So, money and possessions are so much a part of this world's experience that they can actually dominate. Money can determine too much in your life because you're serving it. It can become central. See, it determines where you live. It determines where you work. It determines how you spend your day. It determines what you eat or drink. It determines what you do. It determines if you're going to be happy or not. You see, it becomes and replaces what should be God's place. And that's the deal. That's the reality. It can compete with God in His place like nothing else can. Really. A.W. Pink had a great quote. I'm going to read it quickly because it's so good. He's talking about God and money. I kind of summarized it, but think of this. He says, one commands you to walk by faith, the other to walk by sight. One commands you to be humble, the other to be proud. One commands you to set your affection on things above, the other to set your affections on the things that are on earth. One commands you to look at the things that are unseen and eternal, the other to look at the things that are seen and temporal. One commands you to not be anxious for anything, the other to be all anxiety. See, one to be content, the other for your desires to enlarge. One to be ready to distribute, the other to withhold. One to look at the needs of others, the other to look only at one's own needs. One commands you to seek happiness in God, the other seeks happiness in the world and creation. So is it not plain to see? You cannot serve God and money. And this is the bottom line of where Jesus ended. And this is what He said to the disciples and Pharisees. Pharisees did not like it, did they? Because they were what? Lovers of money. They probably didn't like Luke saying that, but it's the truth. Listen, the Pharisees were lovers of money, and this really made them mad. And this is how the unrighteous steward lived. He was serving his master's money. He was not serving faithfully and lovingly his master, was he? And now he's in that pickle he got in. Well, let me talk for a few minutes about what the parable is not teaching. Kind of went over that some, but just 3 or 4 things briefly. The parable, what is it not teaching? First thing off is it's not a case of buying friends. You can't buy friends. Really, you can't, can you? I mean, that the friendships with if I give Josh enough money, maybe he'll be my friend. Just doesn't work like that. You can't do it, but you can do it in the spiritual way, in the right way Jesus directs us to. And you can't buy friends in such a way that they're going to let you into heaven. I went through that some. But that's number one. That is not teaching that. That is not how we're saved. We're saved by faith alone in the Lord Jesus Christ alone, what he did on the cross, in him alone. Second thing's even bigger than that. Above all, you cannot buy God's favor. You can't do it. You cannot purchase justification, righteousness. You can't pay for it. That's getting into some what we call simony, some Catholic error, or even what Simon did in Acts. How much money do you want? I want to buy whatever you got from the Holy Spirit. You cannot do that. So this parable is not teaching that in any way whatsoever. This parable has a main point, and that's not it. You see, so we want to be careful there. John Calvin, again, he said, Christ does not advise us to purchase by large donations the forgiveness of fraud and of extortion and of wasteful expenditure and of the other crimes associated with unfaithfulness. So Jesus isn't telling us to pay that off. You better use your money. You better pay that mess off. See that? Well, the third thing I thought kind of struck me was he's not teaching that when you're called to give an account before God, you're going to have this window of time to get things right. It doesn't work that way. If you die, that's it. But it would be more the idea of you better wake up now. And now you better pursue wisely the Lord. Fourth thing, this will be the last thing. There could be a laundry list. I'd love to open it up. Fourth thing it's not teaching is that you should not spend a nickel of God's money on anything but the kingdom. In other words, don't you dare do a thing fun and enjoyable and entertaining for your family. That's wasteful. Or, you see, no, he is not driving at that at all. I mean, he does say he gives you resources for everything to enjoy. So some people can go too far thinking, well, this is bondage. This is bondage. I'm a steward of everything God's given me, so I can't enjoy any of it for me or for my children. And you see, he's not getting at that. He's not going there. He's just talking about total unfaithful wasting away his resources. So now the question is, what is the main thing? What's the principle here? What are we getting? What's he driving at? And I'd like to try to say it in several different ways. I'm going to try to say the thing from different points and a few different angles here. Number one, what Jesus is saying is you need to see and understand what's coming and plan for it. Pretty deep. You need to see what's coming and plan for it. See, there's wisdom in planning for the future. And being farsighted in a spiritual sense, and make preparations for it. That's wisdom. Second thing he's saying is if people, unbelievers, can be so smart, so shrewd and wise in gaining success, securing safety for themselves, how much more should the children of God be regarding the things of heaven? See, it's like Jesus giving a sanctifying shove, so to speak. Like, look how wise they're being about the things of the earth. You guys, wise up. Get smart about this. Be wise. Be shrewd. Be wise as serpents about the things that really matter, about heaven, about eternity. Third thing I have, these are multiple things kind of getting into the main essence of what he's talking about. Third thing would be, as Calvin, again, Calvin was very helpful in this. If you want to read him on this, it's great. He says, the leading object of this parable is to show that we ought to deal kindly and generously with our neighbors, that when we come to judgment before God, we may reap the fruit of our liberality. You see? I think that's a lot of what Jesus is saying, and it ties in well with what he said in Matthew 25, where the righteous use their possessions, They fed the hungry. They gave drink to the thirsty. They clothed those who didn't have clothing. They were welcoming strangers, visiting sick and the imprisoned. And the Lord showed that that's the way to use this wealth. Because not only when you do it to them, who are you doing it to? Unto me. Doing it unto me. So we should be faithful stewards, especially of the gospel itself. Faithful stewards of it. It's required, as Paul says. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. And moreover, he said, it's required of stewards they be found faithful. That's 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 2. Think of George Mueller. He just came to my mind. My, oh my, is that guy a shining example? He's to the extreme, exemplary beyond thousands and thousands and thousands of orphans he gave food to and clothing to and met their spiritual needs. They grew up to be adults. You know that they loved George Mueller and would do anything for that guy if they could as adults. Well, I'll close with Jim Elliott's kind of been from the conference, and Brother Mac's sermon, and Brother Philip has shared from his life. He had, I think, the singular, most pithy statement on this whole thing that's almost ever been said. I think while you're thinking it right now, and apparently in his journals, he was journaling on this verse, and this thought came to him. He said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." That's getting to it right there. Amen?